There's a moment that comes to all of us, usually in the quiet hours of the night when sleep eludes us, or perhaps during those tender moments when we're sitting beside a loved one's hospital bed, when we find ourselves staring into the great unknown and wondering what really happens when we take that final breath. It's a question that transcends culture, religion, and time itself, yet it remains one of humanity's greatest mysteries. What happens in those first moments after our heart stops beating? Where does our consciousness go? Is there truly something beyond the physical realm we can touch and see? If you've ever found yourself lying awake at 3 in the morning, your mind racing with these profound questions, you're not alone. Perhaps you've recently lost someone dear to you, and you're desperately searching for answers, for some semblance of comfort in the face of grief that feels overwhelming. Maybe you're at a crossroads in your own life, facing mortality in a way you never have before, whether through illness, age, or simply the growing awareness that our time here is finite and precious. Or perhaps you're someone who has always felt drawn to the mysteries of existence, sensing that there's so much more to reality than what we can perceive with our 5 senses. These feelings, these questions, these moments of deep contemplation about what lies beyond the veil of death are not signs of morbid curiosity or unhealthy obsession. They're signs of a soul that's awakening to the deeper mysteries of existence, a mind that refuses to accept simple answers to complex questions, and a heart that yearns for connection with something greater than ourselves. When we dare to explore these territories, we're following in the footsteps of mystics, philosophers, and seekers throughout history who have recognized that understanding death might just be the key to truly understanding life. But what if I told you that nearly a century ago, a humble man from Kentucky claimed to have peered beyond that mysterious threshold and brought back detailed accounts of what happens in those crucial first 72 hours after we leave our physical bodies behind? What if someone had already mapped out the terrain of that initial journey from life to whatever comes next, and their revelations were so startling, so contrary to everything we've been taught to believe, that they could fundamentally change how we view both death and life itself? Edgar Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet, was no ordinary man. During thousands of trance sessions spanning over 4 decades, this unassuming individual claimed to access a realm of knowledge that transcended normal human consciousness. While in these deep sleep-like states, Cayce would speak with authority about subjects he had never studied, prescribe medical treatments for conditions he had never encountered, and most remarkably for our purposes today, describe in vivid detail the journey that every soul takes during those first critical days after physical death. Now you might be thinking, how can anyone really know what happens after we die? It's a fair question, one that skeptics have been asking for generations. But here's what makes Cayce's account so compelling, and why they continue to captivate researchers, theologians, and ordinary people seeking answers even today. Unlike abstract philosophical theories or religious doctrines that require faith alone, Cayce's descriptions were specific, detailed, and remarkably consistent across thousands of readings. He didn't speak in vague metaphors or comforting platitudes. Instead, he painted a precise picture of the soul's journey, complete with landmarks, challenges, and revelations that awaited every human being who crossed that threshold. What Cayce revealed about those first 3 days after death challenges nearly everything our modern world has taught us to believe about the afterlife. It suggests that death isn't the end we fear it to be, nor is it the immediate transition to paradise or punishment that many religions promise. Instead, according to Cayce's visions, those initial 72 hours represent a complex, transformative process that's both deeply personal and universally experienced by every soul that has ever lived. Perhaps you've noticed how our culture tends to avoid discussing death openly, treating it as something morbid or frightening that should be pushed to the edges of our consciousness. We live in a society that worships youth, chases immortality through technology and medicine, and often treats death as the ultimate failure rather than a natural part of existence. But what if this avoidance is actually keeping us from one of the most important truths we could ever learn? What if understanding what Cayce saw in those mystical visions could not only ease our fears about death, but also transform how we choose to live each precious day we're given? The accounts that emerged from Cayce's trance states weren't designed to comfort grieving relatives or support existing religious beliefs. They were raw, unfiltered glimpses into a realm that exists beyond our physical senses, descriptions that often surprised even Cayce himself when he would return to normal consciousness and learn what he had revealed. These weren't pretty stories meant to make death seem less frightening. They were detailed maps of a territory that every one of us will one day navigate. As you watch this unfold today, I want you to to approach Cayce's revelations with both an open mind and a discerning heart. You don't have to accept everything you're about to discover as absolute truth, but I encourage you to consider how these insights might resonate with your own intuitive understanding of life's deeper mysteries. Have you ever had dreams about deceased loved ones that felt more real than ordinary dreams? Have you ever sensed a presence in the room that you couldn't explain, or felt strongly that consciousness exists beyond the physical brain? Have you ever wondered why the dying sometimes speak to people who aren't there, or why they often seem to see something beautiful just before they pass? These experiences that so many of us have had or witnessed might not be hallucinations or wishful thinking. According to what Cayce revealed during his deep trance states, they might be glimpses of the very reality that awaits us all, previews of the journey that begins the moment our physical heart stops beating and our soul steps into those first mysterious hours of existence beyond the body. The implications of what you're about to learn extend far beyond academic curiosity about the afterlife. If Cayce's visions accurately describe what happens during those crucial first 3 days after death, then understanding this process could change everything about how we prepare for our own transition, how we support dying loved ones, and how we live our lives knowing what awaits us on the other side. It could transform grief from a journey of despair into a process of hope and understanding. It could help us make peace with our own mortality while inspiring us to live more fully and purposefully. But perhaps most importantly, these revelations remind us that we're all connected by this shared destiny, this common journey that transcends all the divisions that seem to separate us in life. Whether you're watching this as someone who's deeply religious, completely skeptical, or somewhere in between, the questions we're exploring today unite us in our common humanity and our shared wonder about the greatest mystery of existence. I'm genuinely curious about your own thoughts and experiences with these deeper questions about life and death. Have you ever had encounters that made you wonder about consciousness surviving beyond physical death? What draws you to explore these mysteries? And what hopes or fears do you carry about your own eventual transition? The community we're building here thrives on these meaningful conversations, and your insights and experiences add so much richness to our collective exploration of these profound topics. If this resonates with you, if you're someone who believes that life's deepest questions deserve our attention and contemplation, I'd love for you to join our community by subscribing to the channel. These aren't easy topics to explore alone, and there's something powerful about having fellow seekers on the journey with you. People who understand that questioning, wondering, and seeking answers to life's greatest mysteries isn't something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated. Together, we can continue exploring these fascinating territories of human experience, supporting each other as we seek understanding about the profound mysteries that connect us all. So take a deep breath, open your heart to possibility, and prepare to discover what Edgar Cayce revealed about those first critical 72 hours that follow our final heartbeat. What you're about to learn might challenge everything you thought you knew about death, but it might also offer you a sense of peace and purpose that transforms how you approach both dying and living. You know that feeling when you're standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, your heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation? I've been thinking about that sensation a lot lately, especially when I consider what Edgar Cayce revealed about those first precious hours after we take our final breath. There's something both terrifying and oddly comforting about knowing that death isn't the abrupt ending we've been conditioned to fear, but rather the beginning of the most profound transition our soul will ever experience. I wonder if you've ever sat quietly beside someone you love as they were dying, watching their breathing become shallow and irregular, seeing something in their eyes that suggested they were already seeing beyond this world. Maybe you've noticed how they sometimes seem to be talking to people who aren't there, or how their face suddenly lights up with a recognition and peace that transcends anything earthly. These moments aren't hallucinations or the brain's final misfirings, according to what Cayce discovered during his deep trance states. They're glimpses of the welcoming committee that awaits us all, the first indication that dying is far more complex and beautiful than we've ever imagined. In those mystical sessions where Cayce's consciousness would journey to realms beyond physical reality, he consistently described how the moment of death isn't really a moment at all, but rather the beginning of a carefully orchestrated process that unfolds over 72 critical hours. Think about that for a moment. While our loved ones are grieving our physical absence, while funeral arrangements are being made and tears are being shed, our consciousness is embarking on the most extraordinary adventure of our existence, guided by forces and beings whose only purpose is to help us navigate this monumental transition. Perhaps you've carried the pain of losing someone suddenly, without the chance to say goodbye, without being able to hold their hand as they crossed over. The guilt can be overwhelming, can't it? The wondering if they were afraid, if they felt alone, if they knew how much they were loved. But what Cayce revealed might transform that anguish into something approaching peace. He described how no soul ever makes this journey alone, how the very moment our physical heart stops beating, we're surrounded by what he called the welcoming ones, souls who have gone before us, spiritual guides who have been with us throughout our earthly journey, and beings of light whose sole purpose is to ease our transition from one state of existence to another. The silver cord that Cayce spoke of isn't just an abstract metaphysical concept, it's the luminous thread that connects our physical body to our eternal soul, the bridge between who we've been in this life and who we're becoming in the next. As this cord begins to loosen in those final moments, our consciousness doesn't simply vanish into nothingness. Instead, it starts to expand, to remember aspects of itself that were temporarily forgotten during our human incarnation. Can you imagine what it must feel like to suddenly remember the vastness of who you truly are, to realize that this earthly personality you've identified with so completely is just one small facet of an infinite, eternal being? But here's what might surprise you most about Cayce's revelations. Those first 3 days aren't a time of judgment or immediate assignment to paradise or punishment. They're a period of profound healing and preparation, a time when our soul is gently helped to release its attachment to the physical world and begin to understand the new reality it has entered. Think of it as the most compassionate rehabilitation program you could ever imagine, designed specifically for the unique needs of each individual soul. During these crucial hours, Cayce described how we encounter what he called the review process, but not in the terrifying way many religions have portrayed divine judgment. Instead, it's an opportunity to see our entire life from a perspective of pure love and understanding, to witness how every choice we made, every relationship we formed, every moment of joy and sorrow contributed to the growth and evolution of our soul. This isn't about punishment or reward. It's about comprehension, about finally understanding the deeper purpose behind everything we experienced during our earthly journey. I find myself wondering how this knowledge might change the way we approach our own mortality. How would you live differently if you knew with certainty that death is not an ending, but a graduation, not a punishment, but a promotion to a more expanded state of consciousness? Would you hold on to grudges with such tenacity if you understood that one day you'll see those conflicts from a perspective that reveals their true purpose in your soul's development? Would you fear aging and physical decline if you knew they were simply the natural preparation for the most magnificent transition you'll ever experience? The astral body that Cayce described isn't some mystical concept reserved for spiritual adepts. It's the vehicle that every human being possesses for navigating non-physical realms. During those first 3 days after death, our consciousness gradually learns to operate through this subtle body instead of the dense physical form we've known for decades. Imagine the liberation of suddenly being free from pain, from physical limitations, from the constant demands of maintaining a biological organism. Yet Cayce also revealed that this freedom comes with its own learning curve, as the soul adjusts to moving through dimensions where thought becomes reality and intention shapes experience. The deceased loved ones who appear to us in dreams, the sense of presence we sometimes feel in quiet moments, the unexplained coincidences that seem too meaningful to be random. These aren't wishful thinking or psychological projections. According to Cayce's visions, they're real communications from souls who are in various stages of their own post-mortem journey, reaching back to comfort and guide those still navigating physical existence. Death doesn't sever the bonds of love. It simply changes how we express and experience those connections. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Cayce's revelations is his description of how these first 72 hours set the trajectory for the soul's continued evolution. The consciousness we've developed during our earthly life, the degree of love and wisdom we've cultivated, the extent to which we've learned to see beyond the illusions of separation and fear, these factors influence where our journey leads next. This isn't about earning heaven or avoiding hell. It's about natural progression, like water finding its appropriate level. Some souls, Cayce revealed, find themselves drawn to realms of learning and service, where they continue to grow and eventually choose to return to physical incarnation with greater wisdom and purpose. Others discover that their earthly journey was their final need for dense physical experience, and they move into realms of pure spirit, where they serve as guides and teachers for souls still navigating material existence. Still others require additional healing and understanding before they can fully embrace their expanded state, and they're lovingly supported in environments designed for their specific needs. What moves me most about these revelations is how they reframe every day of our current existence. If Cayce's visions are accurate, then every moment we spend in this physical body is preparation for the ultimate journey we'll all eventually take. Every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, every choice to love instead of fear is not just improving our earthly experience but preparing us for a transition into expanded consciousness. consciousness. This understanding has the power to transform grief from a destination into a doorway, from an ending into a beginning of deeper relationship with those we love. When we truly comprehend that death is not separation, but transformation, that consciousness continues and love endures, the pain of physical absence can coexist with the joy of knowing our loved ones are experiencing the freedom and expansion they were always meant to embody. As you sit with these thoughts, as you allow them to settle into the deepest parts of your being, I'm curious about what resonates most deeply with you. Does this vision of death as transition rather than termination offer you comfort? Does it challenge fears you've carried or answer questions that have haunted your quiet moments? These aren't just abstract concepts we're exploring. They're possibilities that could fundamentally change how you approach both living and dying. If these reflections have touched something within you, if you find yourself wanting to explore more deeply into the mysteries that connect us all, I hope you'll consider joining this community of seekers and questioners. There's something profoundly healing about sharing this journey with others who understand that life's greatest questions deserve our attention and contemplation, that wondering about consciousness and eternity isn't morbid curiosity, but the natural response of an awakening soul. There's something deeply unsettling about having your entire worldview challenged, isn't there? I've been sitting with Edgar Cayce's revelations about death for months now, and I find myself constantly shifting between moments of profound peace and periods of complete disorientation. It's like discovering that the house you've lived in your entire life has secret rooms you never knew existed, rooms that change everything about how you understand the space you thought you knew so well. When Cayce first began sharing his visions of what happens in those crucial first hours after death, the world wasn't ready for what he had to say. We're talking about the early 20th century, a time when both religious doctrine and scientific materialism had carved out their respective territories with little room for the kind of nuanced, experiential spirituality that Cayce's trance revelations represented. The churches said he was either divinely inspired or dangerously deluded, while the scientific community dismissed him entirely as a charlatan preying on human desperation and grief. But here's what I find fascinating, and perhaps you will too. Nearly a century later, as we've developed more sophisticated ways of studying consciousness and near-death experiences, so much of what Cayce described is being validated by people who have never heard of the sleeping prophet. Doctors are documenting patients who return from clinical death describing the same welcoming beings, the same life review process, the same sense of being guided through a transition that feels both profound and natural. Neuroscientists are struggling to explain how people with no measurable brain activity can have the most vivid, transformative experiences of their lives. Researchers are finding that the more we learn about consciousness, the more mysterious it becomes, and the more Cayce's seemingly impossible revelations begin to sound like accurate reporting from territories science is only now beginning to acknowledge. Do you ever wonder what it says about us as human beings that we've spent so much energy trying to avoid the one experience that every single one of us will eventually have? We'll research every detail before buying a car or choosing a vacation destination, but when it comes to death, we pretend it's not going to happen to us, or we accept simple answers that don't really satisfy the deeper questions of our hearts. Maybe it's because acknowledging the reality of death forces us to confront the possibility that everything we think we know about reality might be incomplete, and that kind of uncertainty can be terrifying when you're trying to build a life based on solid ground. I think about my grandmother sometimes, how she spent her final weeks talking to her deceased sister, as if she were sitting right there in the room. The rest of us exchanged knowing glances, attributing it to medication or the natural decline of an aging brain. But what if we were wrong? What if she was already beginning to perceive the reality that Cayce described, where the boundaries between physical and spiritual existence become permeable in those final days and hours? What if her conversations with invisible presences weren't hallucinations but preparations, introductions to the welcoming committee that would guide her through her own transition? The comfort that Cayce's revelations have brought to millions of grieving people over the past century isn't based on false hope or wishful thinking. It comes from descriptions that ring true in the deepest parts of our being, that resonate with something we've always sensed but could never quite articulate. When he described the soul's journey through those first 3 days after death, he wasn't offering empty platitudes about heaven and angels. He was providing a detailed map of a territory that felt familiar to anyone who had ever had a profound spiritual experience, anyone who had ever sensed the presence of deceased loved ones, anyone who had ever felt the unmistakable certainty that consciousness extends far beyond the boundaries of the physical brain. But let's be honest about the controversy his teachings have generated as well. There's something threatening about the idea that death isn't the great equalizer we've been taught it is, that our consciousness continues and evolves based on the wisdom and love we've cultivated during our earthly journey. It challenges the comfortable notion that death is simply lights out, no more responsibility reality, no more growth, no more consequences. It also challenges religious teachings that suggest our eternal fate is determined by adherence to specific doctrines rather than by the actual development of our character and consciousness. Perhaps most unsettling of all, Cayce's visions suggest that the way we live today directly impacts the quality of our death experience and what comes after. If he's right, then every choice we make, every moment of kindness or cruelty, every decision to grow or to remain stuck in familiar patterns, is preparation for the most important transition we'll ever make. That's a lot of responsibility for beings who often feel like we're just stumbling through life, making it up as we go along, hoping we don't cause too much damage to ourselves or others along the way. I find myself wondering how your own relationship with mortality has evolved over the years. Have you had experiences that made you question the finality of death? Maybe you've felt the presence of someone who had passed away, or had dreams so vivid they felt more real than waking life, or simply carried an inexplicable knowing that consciousness continues beyond physical existence. These experiences often remain private, shared only with our most trusted friends or family members, because our culture doesn't provide much space for these kinds of revelations. What moves me most about the growing body of near-death experience research is how consistently it validates the essential elements of what Cayce described decades before anyone had the scientific tools to study these phenomena systematically. People from vastly different cultural backgrounds, religious traditions, and levels of education return from clinical death describing the same basic elements: the sensation of leaving their physical body, encountering beings of light who emanate unconditional love, experiencing a life review that reveals the interconnectedness of all their choices and relationships, and receiving knowledge that transforms their understanding of existence itself. These aren't people who were particularly spiritual or religious before their near-death experiences. Many were skeptics, materialists, who believed consciousness was nothing more than brain chemistry, yet they return from the threshold of death fundamentally changed, no longer afraid of dying, no longer driven by the same fears and desires that once dominated their lives. They describe a reality so beautiful, so filled with love and meaning, that returning to physical existence feels like waking up from a wonderful dream into a much more limited version of reality. This alignment between contemporary research and Cayce's century-old revelations suggests something profound. Maybe consciousness really does continue after physical death. Maybe love really is the fundamental force of the universe. And maybe the meaning and purpose we've always sensed in life really do extend beyond the apparent randomness and suffering of earthly existence. Maybe death isn't the tragedy we've been conditioned to believe it is, but rather the graduation ceremony we've been preparing for our entire lives. If this is true, then everything changes, doesn't it? The way we treat ourselves and others, the importance we place on material accumulation versus spiritual development, the meaning we find in both joy and suffering, the relationships we prioritize, the legacy we hope to leave behind. Understanding death as Cayce described it doesn't diminish the value of physical existence. It illuminates the profound significance of every moment we're given in these bodies, every opportunity we have to learn and grow and love more deeply. The freedom that comes from truly understanding the continuity of consciousness is unlike anything else I've experienced. When you're no longer afraid of death, you become less afraid of life. When you understand that your choices matter, not just for this lifetime but for your soul's continued evolution, every decision becomes an opportunity for growth rather than just a way to get through another day. When you realize that the love you give and receive becomes part of your eternal essence, relationships transform from mere human connections into sacred opportunities for mutual awakening. But perhaps the greatest gift of Cayce's revelations is how they reframe our understanding of separation and loss. If consciousness continues, if love persists beyond physical death, if our connections with others transcend the boundaries of earthly existence, then grief becomes not just an expression of loss but also an affirmation of the profound bonds that death cannot break. The pain of missing someone we love doesn't disappear, but it can coexist with the deep knowing that love itself is eternal and that our relationships continue to evolve even when they can no longer be expressed through physical presence. As I sit with all of this, as I allow these possibilities to reshape my understanding of what it means to be human, I'm filled with a kind of cautious wonder. Wonder at the possibility that we're so much more than we've been taught to believe, that life has so much more meaning than we've dared to hope, that death might actually be the doorway to experiences more beautiful than anything we can imagine while trapped in these limited physical forms. I'm curious about where these reflections have taken you, what they've stirred up in your own heart and mind. Have they offered comfort for losses you've carried, or have they challenged beliefs you've held about the nature of existence itself? These aren't just intellectual intellectual exercises we're engaging in, they're explorations that have the power to transform how we live and how we prepare for our own inevitable transition. If these conversations resonate with you, if you find yourself hungry for more exploration of the mysteries that connect us all, I hope you'll stay connected to this journey we're taking together. There's something powerful about having companions on the path of questioning and discovery, people who understand that wondering about consciousness and eternity isn't escapism, but the most practical preparation we can make for the adventure that awaits us all.